أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وتركنا بعضهم يومئذ يموج في بعض ونفخ في الصور فجمعناهم جمعا وعرضنا جهنم يومئذ للكافرين أرضا الذين كانت أعينهم في غطاء عن ذكري وكانوا لا يستطيعون سمعا أفحسب الذين كفروا أن يتخذوا عبادي من دوني أولياء إنا أعتدنا جهنم للكافرين نزلا قل هل ننبئكم بالأخسرين أعمالا صدق الله العظيم. Today we begin the final section of Surah Kahf, which is the 8th section. Yesterday we finished the 7th section in which the story of Dhul Qarnayn was mentioned. And there's a very beautiful transition here. The last ayah in the story of Dhul Qarnayn was قَالَ هَذَا رَحْمَةٌ مِّن رَبِّي. Dhul Qarnayn said that this is the mercy of my Lord, meaning the construction he did for the people. He attributed it to being the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it could not have been done unless Allah had wished it to be, and it was basically the kindness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He allowed me to construct this barrier for you. And then he said, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ رَبِّي جَعَلَهُ دَكَّا. But when the promise of my Lord comes, He will make it, what you can say, level to the ground. He will level it to the ground again. وَكَانَ وَعْدُ رَبِّي حَقًّا. And the promise of my Lord is true. So, Dhul Qarnayn himself sort of hinted towards the Day of Judgment. When the Day of Judgment comes, no matter how strong I've made this barrier, it will be leveled to the ground. And now, وَتَرَكْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ. This is now the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, the same topic that Dhul Qarnayn finished off with, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins to speak, and He speaks on that topic. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَتَرَكْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ يَمُوجُ فِي بَعْضٍ وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَجَمَعْنَاهُمْ جَمْعًا. And we will allow them on that day to surge upon one another. وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ. Then it will be blown into the trumpet. فَجَمَعْنَاهُمْ جَمْعًا. And then they all will be gathered. Alright? See this ayah? This made a lot of people scratch their head. Because there's a lot of days, day. Right? There's a lot of pronouns in. There's no definite nouns in this ayah. Right? So, I'll just mention one or two opinions. Well, Allama Qurtubi, a Mufassir, a commentator of the Qur'an, he had mentioned like 3 opinions here. One opinion he mentioned is that of, because it says here, and we will allow them on that day, yawma idhin, on that day. So what day are they talking about? Which day, right? Not the Bajan day. The day as in D-A-Y day, right? So what day are they talking about? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, talking about here. So according to one opinion, and these are the weaker opinions I'm going to say first, right? The day that's being mentioned here is the day that Ya'juj and Ma'juj breaches the wall. Okay? So, with that, it don't relate to what Dhul Qarnayn said at the end. The last ayat I just read. Right? But if you go with that day being the day they breached the wall, we will allow them to surge upon one another. Meaning Ya'juj and Ma'juj will be coming through that wall, and there'll be so many of them. They'll be like climbing on top of one another. Because the word Mawj, Yamuj, actually refers to the waves of the ocean. Right? So there will be how the wave, we could imagine that easily because we live on an island, how the waves of the ocean come onto shore, breaking on top of one another. So Ya'juj and Ma'juj will be coming out from behind the barrier in so many numbers, it will look like an ocean flowing out. Right? So that's one opinion. The other opinion is that Yawma Idhin means the day the barrier was constructed. Because they were so accustomed coming through that passage between the mountains, when they butt it, like how the waves crash onto the cliff and they keep bouncing off. So they were running, and they thought they could scale it. So it's like you got this imagery of people trying to jump and they're falling back on one another, how water just flows and bounces back off a cliff or something. So some says it means the day that the barrier was finally constructed. So with those two opinions, then this ayah will be connected to the story, and it won't have a separate. It doesn't really have a separate. It doesn't belong to this separate section that we're beginning today. But according to the tafsir I did yesterday, and I began with today, is that Dhul Qarnayn hinted towards the day of judgment when he said, "And the promise of my Lord, right, will come. And on that day it will be flattened to the ground again. It will become dakka, flattened to the ground. And the promise of my Lord is true." Okay? So according to the third tafsir, Yawma Idhin means the day of judgment. Right? And which day that is? The same day that barrier will be flattened to the ground. Yes, before that, according to a hadith, it will be breached by Ya'juj and Ma'juj. But that doesn't mean they're going to tear down the whole thing. When the whole thing is going to actually come down and become flat to the earth, that's when the first trumpet is blown. That's when everything is going to be destroyed, right? So, according to that tafsir, and we will allow them on that day to surge upon one another. Meaning when that first trumpet blows and the chaos starts and everything begins to destroy, presently in the world, the humankind and the jinn live separately, right? We are commanded to live separately. There's supposed to be no interaction. But when that trumpet blows and the chaos starts, the jinn, the human being, they will all end up running in such a frantic way, they will surge upon one another. They will be mixed into one another then, right? And it connects better with the next section of the ayah, وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ. So this is the first blowing when the chaos is going to start and when everything is going to be destroyed. And then وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ, and it will be blown into the trumpet, meaning the second blowing. Because after the first blowing of the trumpet, everything will be reduced to nothing. And after the second blowing now, what will happen? فَجَمَعْنَاهُمْ جَمْعًا, we will gather them all. Meaning the insan and the jinn, the human being and the jinn will all now be regathered on the day of judgment. So we understand now that this begins a new section, and this third opinion, to me, I find it more, where you can say, I'll give it preference then, right? So it says here that we will allow them on that day to surge upon one another, meaning the day of Qiyamah when the first trumpet will be blown. وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ, and it will be blown into the trumpet, meaning for the second time. فَجَمَعْنَاهُمْ جَمْعًا, then we will gather them all together, right? Now, let's look into this a bit deeper. First, we must understand the first audience of the Quran were the Arabs. Okay, they came with questions to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to test his prophethood, to see if he's a true prophet. They got their answers. All right. So you got your answers. What's the next what's the next step for them now? If you got your answers, the only logical thing to do now is to believe. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning them of that, because it's just not to answer and get answers and say, oh, okay, well, yeah, he got the answers right, and carry on your merry way again, right? Allah is reminding them that a day is going to come when you're going to be asked questions, right? So it's not just, okay, we tested him, we found out he could answer some questions, and all right, so be it, let's carry on. Life continues. No, life doesn't continue. Allah is now reminding them at the end of the surah of the day of judgment, when it will all matter, right? So that's one thing to think about here. The next thing to think about is how we were relating this surah to ourselves, and how Rasulullah had told us that this surah will be a means of protection of fitan, from all different types of trials. And there were different trials mentioned through different parables and different stories throughout the surah, right? If a person is challenged by an authority that just doesn't like your way of life, there was the story of the people of the cave, and that challenge was discussed there. If a person is challenged with wealth, how one should behave, and that lesson was given there. If one is challenged with intellectual, or you can say superiority, if he has a higher intellect than others, or if one is challenged in the way he's supposed to think, like what's happening nowadays, right? Even in India, they're trying to inject, what you can say, secular studies into the madaris and the courses, to, what you can say, they're trying to modernize, as they would say, the thinking of the Muslims, because they only teach Quran and Hadith in the madaris, and that's all outdated stuff, and they need to come up to time. And they think that's going to solve the problem with the Muslims, and you know what I mean? And Muslims being extremists and this, and they're challenging the thinking of Muslims, even in Islamic countries too. They're trying to reduce Islamic studies and put in more secular studies, so Muslims could, you know what I mean, come to the fore, at least start to live with the times. That's no problem. But if you're challenged with your thinking process, how you're supposed to deal with that, that was discussed. And finally, how to recognize the just systems and which systems are unjust. We heard about that too. So we understood there are a lot of challenges that will be faced coming to the end of times, and how to deal with those challenges. There were parables and stories that gave us lessons on how to deal with each challenge, right? But it's just not about dealing with the challenge. It is how we're going to deal with it, and why must we overcome these challenges in the end, right? What's the end result? What's going to be the end? What's the whole purpose of overcoming these challenges? What's the whole purpose of what you can say, combating these trials and remaining steadfast on faith? What does it all boil down to in the end, right? It all boils down to the day of judgment, right? That we want to be successful on the day of judgment, right? It's just not about reading these stories and hearing, yes, this is how to deal with this challenge, and then we carry on our merry way the same way we were, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings this last lecture section at the end, and then this reminds us specifically about the day of judgment, because this is where it's going to all matter when it's all done, right? If you have protected yourself from all the fitan and the trials of the last times, right, it will matter on this day. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closing the surah with a reminder that this is where it will all matter. This is where it all counts, right? So he says, on that day they will surge upon one another after the blowing of the first trumpet, and then after the blowing of the second trumpet, everyone will be gathered again in the plain of resurrection. وَأَرَدْنَا جَهَنَّمَ يَوْمَئِذٍ لِلْكَافِرِينَ أَرْضًا. And Jahannam, meaning the fire of hell, will be presented on that day clearly, right? Aradana, aradan, right? That brings a type of emphasis, meaning it will be presented clearly on that day. Meaning what? Jahannam will be presented clearly on that day, lil kafirin, to the disbelievers. As we heard before, Jahannam will be brought, right? There's a lot of personification of Jahannam in a hadith. It's like, like a beast. It will be brought with 70,000 reins, and on each rein will be 70,000 angels pulling forward Jahannam and bringing it there to the plane of resurrection. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then describes the behavior of the kuffar. الَّذِينَ كَانَتْ أَعْيُنُهُمْ فِي غِطَاءٍ عَنْ ذِكْرِي وَكَانُوا لَا يَسْتَطِيعُونَ سَمْعًا. Those whose eyes were in a covering from our remembrance. وَكَانُوا لَا يَسْتَطِيعُونَ سَمْعًا, and who could not bear to listen. Okay, as I said, the first audience of these ayat would be the kuffar of Makkah. Those whose eyes were in a covering from our remembrance. Meaning that here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the effect, but actually means is the cause of the effect. The effect is dhikri, the remembrance of Allah. What's the cause of the remembrance of Allah? Looking at His creation. Okay? So the eyes were actually in a covering from looking at the creation of Allah and learning from it. It was as if they were blind. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this point throughout the Qur'an. Right? And because this is the time of the year of judgment, whenever the day of judgment is mentioned, Allah usually mentions the blindness of the kuffar first. Right? Because back in the world, that's what they always demanded. They always wanted to see. What is this Jahannam you keep speaking of? What is this punishment you keep telling us about? Right? Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam been talking about it for 10 years and we can't see anything happening. Is this just a myth? They always challenge Rasulullah that we want to see it. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring it on the day of Jahannam and put it there, right? And let them know, look, see it now. You can see it. You wanted to see it? Here it is, right? So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions their blindness first. That on this day, what? Those were the people. It will be presented to those whose eyes were blinded. Where? Back in the world, right? They wanted to see Jahannam, but they couldn't see the moon, the stars, the sky, all these other creations that they could have learned the oneness of Allah from. They could have seen all these beautiful creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and bring faith. No, but they wanted to see Jahannam, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that blindness first. And then, وَكَانُوا لَا يَسْتَطِيعُونَ سَمْعًا, and they couldn't even bear to listen. Meaning they didn't even want to listen to what? The ayat of the Qur'an, right? So they didn't want to hear or they didn't want to listen, right? So أَفَحَسِبَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَن يَتَّخِذُوا عِبَادِ مِن دُونِ أَوْلِيَاءَ. So do the ones who deny think that they would just take our servants as lords besides us, min duni, besides me, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is rhetorically asking that do these people who denied, meaning the kuffar of Makkah, right? Do they think that they could have just taken my servants as lords besides me, like casually, just take up these idols? Some say ibadi ay makhluki, my creation, or ibadi, because some of them used to worship angels, right? And then this can also be broadened to the Jews and the Christians who take Isa alayhi salam, the Christians who take Isa alayhi salam to be God, and the Jews who take Uzair alayhi salam to be God, the sons of God, sorry. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, did they think that they could have just taken other lords besides me and that would be it, right? There will be no consequence of this action? No. Inna a'tadna jahannama lil kafirina nuzula. Verily we had already prepared a Jahannam for the disbelievers as an accommodation. We already had it prepared for them. They thought that they could just get away with this blasphemy, just say what they want and carry on life and think all will be okay. No, this is what we had prepared for them, right? So as I said, the first audience of these ayat would have been the kuffar of Makkah, right? And then with extension, all the disbelievers that will come to the day of judgment. And as Sheikh Ali Mian Adawi rahimahullah, in the opening ayat, where it was mentioned, قَالُوا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا, that they take a child and they associate a child to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sheikh mentioned that in his, we can say a commentary of the surah, that this is the standout quality of which sect of today? Of the Christians, isn't it? This is their trademark. This is more found in Christianity than any other religion. And if we relate this to Christians, right, to our Christian brothers and sisters, do they think that they could have just taken a servant of ours beside us to be a Lord? Right? Did they think that was just going to be done just like that? قُلْ هَلْ نُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِالْأَخْسَرِينَ أَعْمَالًا. Tell them, O Muhammad, shall I not inform you بِالْأَخْسَرِينَ أَعْمَالًا, of those who are the biggest losers in terms of action, right? Now if we really study Christianity deeply, although as I said, this refers to the kuffar who were of Makkah, who were the first audience of the Qur'an, but by extension it relates to any disbeliever who would associate a partner or some type of deity to be the partner of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we really study the Christian religion, right, what is the core belief? Is that Isa alayhi salam, Jesus as they call him, blood has paid for everyone's sin, right? That's the main belief. So in Christianity, if you really ponder upon this belief, right, this belief is what promotes a lot of materialism. How? If you speak to them too and tell them, look, the Bible mentions you shouldn't eat pork, Bible mentions you shouldn't drink wine, right? They tell you what? That's the Old Testament, right? We don't follow commandments. We don't need to follow commandments because the blood of Jesus has already paid for that, right? So there's no need to follow these commandments. Understood? Right? You're all familiar with our belief in it, right? That this is Jesus' blood already paid for it, so we don't need to follow all of these commandments. So if you're not going to follow commandments, right, and you're not going to do good actions, what else are you going to do in the world then? Right? Huh? What's left to do here? You understand where you came from? And you find that in their preaching and the way the preachers preach too. I heard a lot of preachers on the streets in town sometimes, and all they talk about is the blood of Jesus and he being a mercy and you have to believe in him. But what else is there to do? They don't talk about action. They don't talk about charity. They don't talk about praying. They don't talk about anything else, right? And if you live a good life, what are you promised? You're promised materials, isn't it? I remember a priest came in, shop a day, and one of my staff complained to him, and I ain't getting shown life. So he's like, come to church and give your alms, and you'll be blessed. What is he promoting right there? Materialism again, right? So this core belief in Christianity is what promotes materialism, right? You understand what I mean? This core belief that we don't need action. We don't need good deeds. It's so bad, right, that they don't even understand the word pious. I remember when Maulana was in school and he came to me and said they don't understand what pious means. Right? he was explaining to his teacher was piety. And the word pious, they don't even comprehend what pious means. But piety is not a thing, right? It's nothing to achieve there. All it is be good in this world and you'll be blessed. Blessed in what? In materials. And that's what they promote, right? So that's what we will come to. قُلْ هَلْ نُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِالْأَخْسَرِينَ أَعْمَالًا. Tell them, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, should I not inform you of those who are going to be the biggest losers according to A'mal? Right? Who are those people? Inshallah, I'll let you all know tomorrow. Subhanallah bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka.